Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. India is in the midst of an intense debate on a key climate policy question. Will and should we join the club of nations that have announced a net zero emission target by the mid century? Global pressure is high ahead of the key UN climate change conference COP26 in Glasgow this November, and in at least 12 of the G20 economies, the net zero goal has either been adapted or is under discussion, with China being one of the most recent entrants into that club. But what does this zero emission target mean for India, and what are the very real challenges we face in getting there? Joining me to talk about that is Navroz K, Dubash, professor at the Center for Policy Research, where he studies and commentates on climate change, energy, air, water, and of course the politics of regulation in the developing world. Thank you so much for joining me and speaking with me, Professor Dubash. I want to sort of deconstruct this zero emission conversation, because I think for a lot of people it's quite vague as a concept, and I want to take a few steps back and do some context building over here. First up, where did it start? Because what we are hearing is the middle of the conversation, which is President Biden saying, hey, I want to do this huge conference in April, and I'm very keen that all the nations attending also take on this zero emission pledge. Where did this whole thing come from? Where did it start?
Okay. So in climate change, you typically have to kind of roll back to some sort of scientific consensus, right? And that's true in this case as well. So you can trace this back to the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement basically says that by the second half of the century, the emissions need to be balanced by the uptake of emissions. That is what are called sinks, and that is either through forest growth or through new technologies that are yet to be fully developed, right? So by the second half of the century, that needs to happen if we are to keep to a 2-degree warming threshold or aspire to 1.5 degrees, which is where the damages are less. Okay, so that was sort of 2015. Now, after that, because the possibility of 1.5 degrees as a warming threshold as an upper limit for what would be acceptable came into the conversation, governments asked the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the authoritative scientific body, to look into this question. When they issued their report, I think around 2018 or thereabouts, maybe 2018, 2019, they made a stronger statement. They said to reach 1.5, we must reach on net zero emissions globally by 2050. That is globally, and by emissions, I should specify it's carbon dioxide emissions. Now, carbon dioxide is only one of several greenhouse gases, but they said an important step would be net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050 globally, right? Now, how do you implement that is really the next stage, which is where we are now in the conversation. And first of all, net zero is different from zero because it means that you can actually still be emitting emissions globally, but you have to have some mechanism to suck those emissions out of the atmosphere. The second question is, if you're going to reach global net zero by 2050, then it implies that either every country reaches net zero by 2050, or that some countries do it faster and other countries do it slower, right? So when some countries put on the table that they will reach net zero by 2050, it doesn't leave any space for other countries to say we will do it later. So the more countries that say 2050 is their deadline, the more the pressure rises for the remaining countries to also say 2050 is their deadline. It's just the arithmetic is such that if you want to reach on average 2050. So that is the context where many countries, I think 120 plus at large count, have given a net zero pledge of some sort, either carbon or greenhouse gases, by 2050, in some cases a bit later than 2050, but none earlier than 2050. Okay? So the question is, by the big meeting in December this year, where will we have got to in terms of the large countries and how well aligned they are with that vision of where we have to get to?
So here we have 2015, and as you said, now we have 2021, which is why I guess the conversation is really building in a crescendo for itself, which is the Glasgow COP26 summit. The more simplistic question, though, Professor, is is net zero emission the answer to the world's climate problems? Because as you said, uh, there's no specification on how these emissions are being achieved at this point, from what one understands of the conversation and the dialogue around it.
Mm. So I have I have very mixed feelings about the net zero concept.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it is a very powerful rhetorical concept. It has the word zero in there, which is easy to understand. It has a common objective for all countries, which replaces what the Paris Agreement had. It doesn't replace it, but as a rhetorical device, it offers an option. Yeah. Paris said every country should do what they can do based on their national circumstances, nationally determined contributions. So some countries said we will peak our emissions. Some countries said we will go to zero. Some countries said we will reduce the intensity of our emissions. It's very hard to calculate all these things. So net zero has this kind of compelling narrative force. And it also allows companies, communities, states to also adopt net zero targets. So it's very persuasive. But that persuasiveness comes at a little bit of a cost. And there are two costs. One, because it is net, it does mean that there is a risk it will allow countries to issue a net zero pledge, but continue emitting emissions now, saying simply that we are depending on the fact that there will be technologies that allow us to suck up those excess emissions in the future. So it risks delaying action in that sense. The second thing it does is, because governments are not typically accountable beyond their own electoral term, a 2050 pledge is relatively costless. What we really need to know is what are countries and governments going to do now in the next 5 years? And that's particularly important for countries like India, because if we don't act now, we will lock in to a higher carbon emission future, right? Once we build more buildings, build more roads, build buy inefficient ACs, we are locked into those emissions. So there's an urgency to it that the net zero by 30 years from now kind of framing doesn't really capture, right? Now, I feel that the middle ground here, and I think what I've been advocating is a middle path. Net zero is a very important and useful long-term aspirational story. For some countries, particularly those that have already peaked their emissions have reached a maximum, they're on their way down. It's a good way of driving them down faster. For countries like India that are increasing, where our emissions are increasing, and basically everybody agrees that some of the poorer countries do still need to increase our emissions because we need to increase our energy use. Now, over time, those increased energy needs will be met by low carbon technologies, but we're not fully there yet. We're making that transition. During that period, some other formulation complementary to net zero and more specific is needed. So my middle ground is this. I don't think that we should be saying, like some people do, that because India hasn't caused the problem, we should sit back on our heels and wait. Because there is an opportunity here to pivot to a low carbon future, create jobs, and so on. On the other hand, saying that we should leap out ahead of every other country and commit to a net zero target by 2050 commits India to an extremely steep and sharp decarbonization that has never been done in history before. It is a little risky, more than a little risky. So I think the middle path is, say, net zero is a great idea for the future. In the short run, we're going to turn around our electricity systems, turn around our transport systems, and do some very concrete development-led transitions.
Is there clarity, though, Professor, in terms of, because you mentioned this at the start of your response, on what India's emissions are at the moment? I know the stated numbers are that India is number 3, third to the United States and China, but equally, we're 1/8 of what the United States is. Again, we're about 1/3 of what China is. Do we have a sense of what our emissions are at this point to even understand the enormity of what is being demanded of us?
So I think we have a pretty good handle on what our emissions are now. And one of the merits of the international process is they've forced every country, or they've got every country to agree to produce these biennial update reports and so on that document our emissions and how they change over time, their sources, and so on and so forth. So when you talk about what India's emissions are, it's confusing, because are we talking about annual emissions? Are we talking about per person emissions? Are we talking about total emissions over time, which is cumulative emissions? From a climate point of view, the atmosphere only cares about cumulative emissions, actually, how much you've emitted over historical time. And it cares about absolute emissions because that's how much we're adding to the problem every year. The atmosphere doesn't care about per capita emissions or per person emissions. But as societies, we care about that because if you're starting from a low per capita emissions, it means you're a poorer society. So the 1/3 that you mentioned and the 1/8 and so on is on a per capita basis. We are 1/3, a little less than 1/3 the emissions of China per capita and about 1/8 that of the US per capita. We are third or fourth, depending on how you count the European Union, whether you count it as a bloc or not, in terms of our annual contributions. So here's the dynamic and the dilemma for India. The world can't solve this problem without India because we are the third largest emitter, although we are substantially behind the first two, right? So China is on the order of 30% emissions, the US on the order of 18 to 20% emissions. We are down at about 6% emissions, so a distant third. And there are many other countries right around us, Germany, Japan, Russia, and so on. So we can't solve the problem without India. On the other hand, India has a is a much poorer country with a big development burden ahead of it. So should we be asked to lead the charge, right? And even if we're not asked to lead the charge, we have opportunities because we haven't locked into high carbon development pathways. So again, I think we have to find a way between making this all about this being a downside risk for India and all about it being only unmitigated opportunity. It's somewhere in between. We have to feel our way. We have to move our system as fast as we can without shackling ourselves, because there are risks here.
On this point that you made about cumulative numbers, though, Professor Dubash, I think that's another point that has emerged for people saying, hey, this is at loggerheads with an important tenet of the Paris Climate Agreement, which was basically common but differentiated responsibility. Are some of the larger nations sort of, pushing this into a bit of a bully contest where you're forcing other nations that don't have that much cumulative baggage to get onto this platform and to make these agreements and to make these understandings?
Right. So I think you've touched on a very important principle. This idea of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities is actually the full form. And what that says is that yes, we understand that different countries are going to move at different speeds in terms of decarbonization, both because they didn't contribute so much to the problem, the cumulative emissions point, and because they're starting with weaker capacity because we're a poorer country, may not have the technological and other expertise, and so on. Now, for too long, I think that approach led to India saying, we shouldn't be asked to do anything at all, right? And the problem with that argument is that the many things that India could have done for mitigation also bring development gains. For example, shouldn't we be building public transport systems rather than private vehicle systems just for our own sake? Well, guess what? It also brings mitigation, right? So we should have been doing those co-benefits based actions, co-benefits meaning co-benefits between development and mitigation. We should have pursuing that perhaps more actively than we did in the early years of this process. Over the last decade, I think we have been pursuing that. On the other hand, we do need to hold on to that principle for the reason we discussed at the beginning of this interview, right? Which is that in case we get to a situation where the world says, okay, crisis, we need to limit warming to 1.5. We can do it at best by 2050. In order to reach 1.5, you also have to do it by 2050. Then I think that's where differentiated responsibility comes in. You say, actually, no, we will try our best, but it does mean a much faster and steeper decline for a country like India, right? So the transition that the West will take over 50 years, we will have to do in 20 years. I mean, just to put some crude numbers on it, or even less than 20 years. And that implies a potentially higher costs. So that's why differentiated responsibility remains an important principle, but I don't think we should fetishize it either, right? Again, we have to find middle paths. We have to find pragmatic solutions that allow us to be part of the solution while not locking ourselves in and placing the cost of a burden on the back of India's poor. And I think that's a really important principle.
I want to talk in more detail about that particular aspect of it, Professor. What is the impact for India that we're looking at? The first one, as you mentioned, of course, is in terms of loss of incomes and jobs. Uh, is there a way around it? And what potentially could we be looking at in terms of economic damage if indeed we go down this path of signing up for net zero emissions?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, the only way we know to talk about these things, damages, both climate damages as well as economic costs of adjustment, job creation and destruction, is through economic models. And these models are very, very difficult to put together in the best of circumstances. They're even harder to put together for a country like India because there are so many degrees of freedom, right? We are going through an urbanization transition. We are going through a demographic transition. We're going through a transition where we're moving from agriculture to manufacturing and services. We're building out our infrastructure. We could do this so many different ways that what we find is that models diverge rapidly in their projections of the future. And it's not just projections based on things like carbon price or cost of renewable energy. It's projections that diverge based on the form of India's urbanization. If all our cities look like LA in 15 years versus all our cities looking like Amsterdam in 15 years, it's a very different pattern of energy use and a very different kind of life quality, right? So those choices make a huge difference. In the West, those models are perhaps a little simpler to run because a lot of those decisions have already been made. LA is not going to become Amsterdam tomorrow, and Amsterdam is not going to become LA tomorrow, to put it somewhat bluntly. But many of our cities could still go in either of those directions, right? Perhaps Amsterdam's not the best example. We're not going to have canals, but a dense European city, put it that way. So we can spin stories through models that say we have a rosy, high carbon, a low carbon, jobs rich future if we suddenly become really successful in X and Y technologies. Or we could tell a story where we need a lot more carbon and our economic competitiveness is limited and we will lose jobs. Both stories can be told. They're both scenarios. And we need to now understand the feasibility of the scenarios and how to pull a lever that gets us on one versus another. And that's the conversation we need to have. How do we pivot India to a high jobs, low carbon, innovative society, right? And that's a difficult thing to do. We've not been great at bringing about those kind of macro structural shifts in the past. So the answer to your question is we don't have a good handle on the costs. We have a partial handle on the opportunities. And we need to use those models in ways that allow us to have policy conversations with industry to maximize the chances of the desirable outcomes. But because we don't know the costs, we don't want to tie our hands either, which is why there's been a lot of pushback against the net zero by 2050 target idea as a hard target, at least.
And even as this, global pressure is building, Jayant Sinha, an MP from the ruling BJP, has submitted a private member's bill suggesting that there should be a legally binding net zero commitment, and that in turn would bring in billions of dollars for India in terms of investment. I just want your thoughts on that and whether it does look like that would be the outcome if we were to do this.
Mhm. No, so I think there's been a rich conversation. Mr. Sinha has been part of it. He and I have talked a couple of times, and I know he's talked to many other people. And I welcome lots of voices in this. This is a complex issue, and so it's good to have the pot stirred now and then. My own take on this is that I think the highlighting the opportunity to India from a low carbon future is a very welcome message and is long overdue. I think for Indian business to take on board that message and see what we can do to realize it, to think aggressively ahead about things like a hydrogen economy emerging in India is again, these are all signals that are important to send. Where I think we differ a little bit in our views, well, more than a little bit, is that the hard, legally binding nature of what he proposes doesn't give us too many options. It commits us to one of two. It commits us to one of two things. Either we give that target without taking it particularly seriously. In other words, to make a legally binding pledge, knowing that we may well fail, which is not, I think, any of us as citizens of India would want us to go down that path, or to take it very seriously and essentially tie our hands to the mast in a way where there is a very definite chance that we will fall short. What worries me about that approach is that, yes, there is lots of opportunity. From the business side, there are opportunities to be had, but we don't want to take an approach that privatizes opportunity and socializes risk, right? What if that doesn't happen? And again, we cannot say with any certainty that we will reach there without imposing costs on India's poor. It would be the largest, steepest decarbonization in history by some distance, right? That's not a monkey we want to place on the back of India's poor at this critical time. Where I think we should go is sector by sector approaches. Now, one thing that Mr. Sinha argues is that a strong, credible pledge will lead to India being seen as a global champion and lead to investments flooding in. Now, my own view is, because this is a pledge what he proposes is a pledge 30 years out, and it is a pledge at an economy-wide level, and it includes this fudge factor of net, right, which means that we're just hoping that we can reduce some of the emissions through sinks. It doesn't actually send a great signal to investors. Because what is an investor going to take from that about power sector investments today, or transport investments today, or hydrogen investments today? Yeah. We need to actually come up with tighter, narrower pledges around particular sectoral shifts. We know our electricity sector is in transition. We know we have to do something about our discoms. We know we have to think about our coal transition. Let's have those conversations. What do we need to really shift the electricity sector? What do we need to do to really shift the transport sector? Those are the kinds of conversations that will really attract investors. So even from that point of view, I'm not sure a net zero pledge by 2050 is either necessary and is certainly not sufficient, right? What is more important is to get into the nitty-gritty of the next decade.
Has that been our Achilles heel, though, Professor? And I don't mean this only for climate change, because, this has been the norm, if you will, over the last couple of years, where policies have set out something completely else from what has actually fructified on ground. For example, as you said, does India know its emissions peak year at this point? Does India have, carbon neutrality targets at sectoral levels? Equally, do we have finance lined up? Are you fearful that policy is going to go one way and reality is going to go another over the next couple of years? Or are you feeling more hopeful about the fact that we've got some targets in place and we're working on them?
So look, I've been at this for quite a long time. So, I would have to be hopeful for me to continue at it. And where I see hope really is that, the conversation has changed so much. We no longer assume that climate mitigation is always a detriment to development. We see lots of spaces where they can go together, right? What I'm arguing against is flipping too far over to say they always go together unconditionally under all circumstances, right? We don't want to flip over that far either. But where you're right is to say that at the moment, our policymaking establishment isn't really geared up towards making these big picture long-term transitions. We, like many other governments, work in ministerial silos. Environment is normally in charge of climate change, but it has no say over power, transport, industry, etc. Forests, it has control of forests, of course. So, but broader land use. So we can't operate in a governance structure that is broken into these silos. The second thing we don't have is we don't have a long-term strategic body, some place where we think about what our long-term strategy is. Every 4 or 5 years, when a big climate meeting like Paris or Copenhagen before that, or now Glasgow comes up, we scramble to run some models and figure out what we should do. We need to have a long-term strategic effort to figure out how India will evolve over time. And the third piece that we don't have is we don't have a way of building consensus, saying if we have two different visions of the future, for example, the legal net zero commitment versus what I'm proposing, which is the development pathways led thing, how do we sort that out in the public domain through some deliberative process? So one of the things we are doing at CPR is proposing a mechanism for climate governance that will start building these parts of government. That is not to say a top-down directive mechanism, but a mechanism that allows for better analysis, better conversation, and better coordination across ministries. And what we found in looking at other countries is many countries lack this kind of climate governance structure. And I think what we'll see is if we're truly going to pivot to low carbon futures, we need to work. We need to build states that are capable of driving this change and states that are more open to conversation with their business, with their citizens, with their communities, to bring them all on board. And this is a shared endeavor, right? So both as a technocratic objective, but also as a political objective. We don't have the mechanisms in place. We don't have the institutions in place. And I think it sounds very wonky to talk about institutions, but actually this is too complex a problem for us not to have some sensible, structured, ongoing way of dealing with it that builds on itself over time. So we don't just react every few years when we're forced to a wall by a diplomatic situation.
Let me ask you this, and I hope you give me a candid answer. The irony is also that here's a government that wants to take a leading role in fighting, climate change. They want this to be a poster boy moment for them while there is this much attention. And equally, here's a government that has put out what are widely recognized as extremely detrimental environmental policy norms in order to encourage private investment or public investment. The impact assessment report now is more and more dilutive in terms of getting opinions from stakeholders on what the impact for the environment may be. Does this not sit at crossroads when you're trying to project yourself as a climate change campaigner, but you're also taking moves that seem quite detrimental to precious forest land and to the nation's environment? I understand some of this is geopolitical forces, in terms of what happens with our borders and water sharing, etc. But does this not sit at crossroads with each other?
I think it's a very good question. Look, the being environmental in this day and age means multiple things, right? It means giving serious attention to environmental protection, right? So wildlife, forests, and so on and so forth, the so-called green agenda. It means curbing pollution, the so-called brown agenda, right? And it also means green transformation, which is bringing bringing the economic agenda together with the environmental agenda. Right? I think you've correctly noted that this government has been critiqued quite heavily on the green agenda. Right? They've been accused of weakening the EIA notification. I think that when it comes to the brown agenda, there are some notable problems. For example, we keep pushing out the date for compliance of power plants with emission norms, which I think is a really sore point, and it's a problem. There are other areas where they have done, I mean, I think we have to be even-handed here. There are some areas where they've done some good things. The biggest of them being the scheme to provide gas-based cooking for women, which reduces indoor air pollution, right? So air pollution is a huge problem. Indoor air pollution is the biggest part of it in India. And so the switch to cooking gas is a great positive. But yes, on balance, I don't think one can say that the credentials of this government to put environment high on the agenda are that robust, because there have been lots of trade-offs, as you say, with ease of doing business, and that sort of narrative has prevailed, that we need to prioritize ease of doing business. What's interesting about this moment is the green and the brown narrative are related to, but not directly tied to, the green transformation narrative. So you could actually even think in terms of a green transformation to a renewable energy future while you're not doing a whole lot on the other two parts of it, right? So they're not entirely delinked, but you can actually have this disconnected, dissonant approach to it. So this government, for the reasons that it likes to have dramatic big picture changes, is interested in this green transition narrative because it sees it as a job creating narrative. And for environmentalists, I think we have to be smart about this, right? I think we must absolutely hold the government's feet to the fire on some of the things where they're falling short. But I think we have to also think hard about how we put our weight behind a green transformation narrative, a narrative that sees the future of Indian development and job creation being tried to sunrise industries, right? But a very important caveat there, because as an environmentalist, I'm also equally committed to social justice, and many of my friends are as well. I think we have to make sure that green transition doesn't happen at the cost of the poor and the weak. So if we are moving to a renewable energy future, we have to, with equal, if not more urgency, think about a transition for coal-dependent states. Where is their job future going to come from? What's going to happen in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand? We have to find a way that the winners of the green transition make sure that those who are risk being left behind have alternative livelihoods, right? And that is something that has to happen at a national level because these are regional differences. And for the same reason, we have to be wary of that hard net zero by 2050 cap, right? So I think we have to embrace complexity. You know, we have to be willing to say they are falling short on this part of the agenda, they're doing okay on this other part of the agenda, and they have the right intentions on this third part of the agenda, but could be doing a lot more. I think those are not necessarily contradictory statements. It's a complicated world. We as environmentalists have to embrace that, right?
Absolutely, you're right. And more important than ever, given what COVID has done to our economy and made it an even more inequitous society, it's important that we work for the bottom half of the pyramid. One final question then. If we do choose to go with pragmatism and say, hey, we're not up for the net zero game, but here's what we intend to do with regards to the Paris Climate Agreement, should we be fearful of any international backlash, or do you think this is perfectly fine and India can carry on with its own intent in terms of climate change norms?
So I really push back against and disavow the word pragmatism, right? Because and I think the answer to my question lies in that pushback. So I don't see what I'm proposing as a pragmatic approach. I see that the net zero by 2050 approach is a bit foolhardy because we don't have the information to back it. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be very effective because it's too far off in the future to matter to industry. And it has this jugglery of the net part of the story. What I am suggesting by focusing on short-term transitions is not pragmatic. It actually has a higher chance of leading to a low carbon future for India. And therefore, I think if we play this game smartly, that's our solution to the diplomatic pressure. We actually have to say, actually, we're not being unambitious by refusing to give a net zero target. To the contrary, we think we're being super ambitious because we are shifting ourselves in the near term with a higher degree of probability, and we're not taking net zero off the table for the future, incidentally. So those of you who are only getting by with a net zero target, sorry, but please tell us what you're doing in the next 5 to 10 years, right? So I think we can actually seize that high ground of ambition if we tell the story right. And there's a second piece of this diplomatically. At least half the world, notably Africa, and I note that Minister R.K. Singh sort of had a shout out to Africa in his recent remarks to the IEA. Half the world is in the same boat we are. We absolutely need to pivot to low carbon futures because we're vulnerable, but we also need to develop. So if India can figure out a way to do that, then we become the leader of a huge chunk of the world who is still trying to figure out how to make how to solve these two difficult problems simultaneously. So rather than pragmatism, when I say there's a middle path, I mean it's a middle path between extreme views that are neither very helpful, neither of which are very helpful. One view locks us into something without necessarily guaranteeing we would shift, which is the net zero path. The other view, which says we need to wait for the West to move first, risks us being left behind as a society of the future when the future is going to be a low carbon future. So this is a conceptually middle path, but it's not middle of the road. It's not pragmatic. It actually has the potential to be more transformative than the other two paths. And that's really the thought that animates me. And you asked if I had hope, and I think that as long as we are creative and we think hard about how to realize those things, there's no reason why we shouldn't have hope. It's an enormous challenge, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think there's a reason why we've shifted from calling it climate change to the climate crisis. I think there's a reason why we've shifted from calling it climate change to the climate crisis. But I think that we have no choice but to really try and forge ahead, but do so in ways that are not dictated by others, nor should we uncritically accept frameworks that may not apply to us quite as well as our own.
Absolutely. And I hope we make the right decisions come April and, of course, come COP26. It's been a fascinating chat. Thank you so much for your time today and for walking our viewers through this complex but extremely important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitali. Thank you for having me on this conversation.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.